If we can't reopen our society in the next few weeks, when will we?
Those of us who make these rules have got to stick by them, and that's why I've got to resign.
We've seen chaos, confusion and cronyism at the heart of government.
I fully understand the strength of feeling. Indeed, if it had been lawful, I'd have been there. I'd have been at a vigil.
Hello and welcome to Politics at the Edge from the University of East Anglia. According to the United Nations, violence against women and girls has increased during the COVID-19 pandemic. Cases of domestic abuse have gone up, and outside the home, violence against female health workers is also on the rise. Many women have reported an increase in harassment in public spaces, perhaps while out exercising. And with many in precarious employment, there's also an increased risk of sexual exploitation. The data's still being gathered. We don't have concrete numbers, but anecdotally it's a worrying picture. So what's going on? Why is it happening? And what can we do about it? On the podcast today, as always, Professor Eylem Finlayson, and with us, Dr Helen Warner, Senior Lecturer in Gender at UEA, Aaron Grant, Head of Security here at the University, and Eylem Atakav, Professor of Film, Gender and Public Engagement. So let's talk about the scale of the problem first. Aaron, how prevalent is the sexual violence in young people from the research that you've done?
I'd say it's increasing at a frightening rate. So some statistics on a Revolt sexual assault study with the student room. So they reached out across 153 higher education institutions within the UK, and they had 4,500 student responses, of which 62% claimed that they had been a victim of sexual violence. Of those responders, 70% of those were female, with 26 male. The ONS, again worryingly, estimate that 4% of all females have experienced rape. And of that 4%, 8% said it was whilst they were studying at a UK university. So it appears that sexual assault reports have gone up over the last 4 years, and they've actually gone up by about 111%, and that looks like it continues to rise. Is that a case of we are seeing more? Are we having more people now coming out and voicing, what's happened to them? Have we got better reporting tools? I don't know, but it's certainly a trend going in the wrong direction.
And Eylem, what's your research been showing you?
So the research that I've done recently wasn't necessarily looking at domestic abuse survivors and victims, but it was looking at the domestic abuse sector's experience of the pandemic, because they were dealing with quite a lot during particularly the first lockdown, when they had to shut down services from face-to-face to phone calls. And we're looking at 75% or so reduction in service delivery for the domestic abuse sector when the calls to helplines that they were receiving, for instance, for one charity, Karma Nirvana, had gone up by 200%. Men's advice line from Respect had gone up 100% around that time. So we're looking, or have been looking, because the implications of the pandemic and domestic abuse in general are continuing to this date as well. We're looking at a sector which has been dealing with essentially vicarious trauma by people bringing people's issues around domestic violence to their own home spaces, thereby, as one of the interviewees I've spoken to for the film that we made says, contaminating their homes in a way.
Well, one of our reporters, Jasmine Oak, went out in Norwich to ask women if they feel safe when they go out in the city around here.
To a certain extent, yeah. I'm very much used to walking around during the day now because I have my little boy usually. Anything sort of in the evening, no, not so much, as I don't have the same confidence I did when I was a teenager, for sure.
General, do I feel safe walking around? There's certain parts of Norwich I wouldn't walk after a certain time at night. A lot of dealings going on.
I used to, but not so much anymore. Just because obviously what's been happening recently, and I don't know, I just don't feel as safe as I used to.
Yes, I do. I'm not really scared of people in the streets and that around Norwich, no.
As safe as I would anywhere, but I think we're talking about women's safety, aren't we? So I think being a woman, you're kind of sort of from a very young age, you're not safe. You just know you're not safe. You don't even think about it. So I kind of feel safe, but I'm on guard,
So those interviews were about perceptions of risk, and we talked to those women shortly after the Sarah Everard case. Helen, do you think it's to do with feeling safe is to do with what we experience or what we see on the news and on social media?
Well, I think I was really struck by the last comment of the interviewer, where they talked about that, yes, they feel safe, but they recognise that they're a woman, and from a very young age they've been taught not to feel safe, and to always be on their guard. And I think that that's a really important point, that there's just an expectation that as a woman you are unsafe, and that you need to take responsibility for that safety, even though you have no choice over whether harm is going to be perpetuated against you. Certainly, we're confronted with images of violence being perpetuated against women across all media and popular culture, and that contributes to this general feeling of not being safe. In addition, I think we are socially conditioned to accept a level of risk for being a woman in society. One of the things that I do with my students, and I can't take credit for this because I saw it somewhere else, was that I ask the students, those who identify as women or non-binary, what precautions do they take in order to keep themselves safe when they're outside? And they'll give me a list, an extremely long list of things that they'll do, like go to the toilet in pairs, put their keys in between their fingers, and it goes. There's hundreds. Keep their finger over their bottle top so that they don't get spiked. And then I ask the cis men in the room, well, what do you do? And they do nothing. And that is a really revealing exercise for thinking about the how internalized those feelings of risk are, and the precautions that women take. And I think it's all of those reasons that you mentioned. We are confronted with those images, we see them all the time. We're constantly told that it's women's responsibility to be safe, even that we're talking about women's safety as opposed to violence against women, or male violence perpetuated against women, and therefore we make women responsible for their own safety when really they have absolutely no choice over what may happen to them.
I think that's a really interesting, important point that you raised there, Helen. If we made that shift from, instead of talking about women's safety and structuring our policies and our plans all around how do we make women safe or feel safe and what should they do, if we shifted it and thought, well, okay, we've got a problem of perpetration of a certain kind of crime here, how would that shift, do you think, our sort of policy attitude, both kind of nationally, but also in the local context that we all live and work in university, in our town, in our lives?
I think that's a really important shift, and obviously I'm not the first person to come up with this idea. There's a rich feminist history of talking about the importance of naming things and the importance of recognizing men and masculinity's implication in this. But one of the things that's happened at our level, at a university level, is there's a problem not only with these crimes being committed, but also a problem with bystander syndrome, where people don't feel confident. If they see something happening, they don't feel confident to intervene, and often that's because it's normalized to such an extent that we accept this level of violence. We accept that it may happen, and that people will feel uncomfortable, and that lads being lads at university will cross boundaries, and therefore their friends don't, male friends don't feel the need to intervene. They don't feel the need to speak up, and that's a real problem. And there's been some really great work by Alison Phipps and Vanita Sundaram on universities and how they can tackle this, and bystander syndrome is one of the biggest things that they identify.
So from your point of view, is part of the issue here what people understand by male violence and what counts as a violent act, and so it's part of the challenge to kind of shift people's understanding of situations or events, and seeing something as actually this is beyond the pale, this is inappropriate, this is wrong, rather than thinking, oh, this is sort of a normal behavior or a thing we put up with or a thing that just happens.
One crucial thing is recognizing that this happens on a continuum, that this violence doesn't just exist as one bad apple acting out and committing a crime against a woman. This is part of a bigger cultural issue where certain kinds of behaviors are normalized and accepted as just a general part of life. And this is where we get issues at university where certain kinds of behavior or banter or kind of lad culture normalizes kinds of violence against women that leads to a dehumanizing of women, and therefore violence becomes inevitable. And so one of the issues that we really need to address is recognizing that violence exists on a continuum, that it can start as something as, kind of inverted commas, minor, as just shouting to someone to smile on the streets, kind of feeling that you have that ability to make someone feel unsafe in public. And, you remind women that actually, no, you're not supposed to be in this public space by shouting at them in the streets. That is arguably, and again, inverted commas, a kind of minor act of violence, but the fact that we normalize it and we legitimize it inevitably leads to it means that it escalates, and we end up with these kind of really horrific attacks that we've been reading about recently.
I want to ask Aaron, how do you think things have changed over the decades that you've been in security, and how are your staff having to adapt to this and this kind of behaviours which Helen describes as being normalised, which can sometimes escalate and to lead to other more criminal behaviour?
No, absolutely, and I fully agree with what Helen was saying. I'd also just like to expand. You made a very valid comment that women are almost conditioned from a young age and taught maybe by their parents how to be safer, when actually we should maybe thinking about educating our sons from a young age as opposed to our daughters on what is acceptable behaviours. I'd like to give a small example. So my daughter, she was 12, so 2 years ago she was 12, she came to me, and on her Instagram post a male had approached her and he'd asked for sexual favours, and then he'd sent some photographs of a nature which no 12-year-old should see. She did the right thing, and she blocked and she screenshot and she reported it to myself and to the school. Made me think though, my 10-year-old son. So I then had that opportunity to sit with him and actually go through about acceptable behaviours and how it starts in social media. And I think that's a really good point, because that education then should continue through schools and universities, and that could help develop that peer pressure that it's not acceptable, and to call out your male friends and the lad behaviour. And we need to get to a state where we self-police, we do that peer policing. Unfortunately, certainly from a university perspective, we are seeing an increase in the drinking and the hookup culture. The social media, the dating sites. We also look through the student social media sites and how they engage with each other. And I think it's fair to say there's a lack of respect between the female versus male, and it's almost like a lack of respect for themselves. And then you get a lot of things like slut shaming, and it perpetuates this laddish behaviour, and it really does. So the security team, officer, we're here at the front line. So we respond to anything on campus. And yes, we do respond to allegations of sexual assault, violence and rape. So yes, it does happen. And we're very sensitive to it.
So we mentioned, how do we deal with it on campuses? So I spoke to John Sharp, he's the Director of Student Services at UEA, on how they deal with allegations of sexual assault between students.
Quite often students don't want to go to the police for a range of reasons, but we have still got an obligation as a university to look into a possible breach of our regulations. We have to be really careful that we don't frame that as the university investigating a sexual assault, because it's the courts that make determinations about sexual assault. So we frame it in terms of our regulations. It's an investigation into possible sexual misconduct, and we have to balance the interest of the reporting student and make sure they feel really well supported. We can offer them counselling support, wellbeing support, as I said before, referral into external agencies who can support them. But we do also have to explain to that student, for their sake and as well as just in terms of the principle, that this is tricky, it is difficult to reach a conclusion, and the conclusion will have to be based on the evidence that's available. Because if we adopted a model that said the accusation in itself is sufficient, the inadvertent effect of that is that could allow people with unpleasant motives to exploit that. So it is horribly tricky. It's also really difficult for the individual about whom the report's been made. And in student services, our role is to support students. And so we will support both students with the issues that they're going through.
So John Sharp there, the Director of Student Services, one of the things he talks about is when victim survivors don't want to go to the police, and the rates of people reporting their sexual violence to the police are still very low. Why do we think that hasn't changed? Why do we think that hasn't improved?
If I may come in on that, judging on some other interviews that I had done with women who have gone through serious violence, mental and psychological and physical and so on, and sexual violence, it's very hard for anyone to speak out, because every time they speak out about their experiences, they're perhaps reliving those experiences. And from a research perspective, from an academic perspective, it's fraught with ethical issues, obviously doing research on these. But so you get to see really clearly how traumatizing or re-traumatizing it is for victims and survivors. Yet at the same time, it's empowering to speak out. And we're talking about an issue here that is particularly linked with the pandemic, as Aaron was saying. It's become doubly complicated, triply complicated, in fact.
We can't be surprised, I think, at the few survivors who do feel able to go to the police about it, because we know what the statistics are in terms of prosecution rates for rape cases. So, as Eylem says, that's a huge amount of emotional labour. It can be re-traumatizing for possibly, not the kind of justice outcome that you would hope for. One thing that strikes me about John's comments is the concern of false allegations, when we know that the statistics for false allegations are so low. And significantly, there's been research done that show that I think it's like 1%, something really, really minor, the number of false allegations there are. But we know that significantly, the most false allegations are levelled towards men of colour as well. And so we know that there's a racial element to this as well. And equally, we know that there are certain kinds of women who are not supported by the justice system. We know that sex workers and women of colour have historically been abused at the hands of the state. So it doesn't surprise me at all that those numbers are so low.
Just precisely on that, I was listening to Jess Phillips talking about this, about non-disclosure agreements at workplaces and on campuses, on university campuses. If there is no legal, so if women are completely abused and silenced legally, and there's no legal system or a bill to back up and support these people, men or women or girls or boys, then obviously people will, exactly as Helen's saying, are not going to be tempted to come forward to talk about it. I think the law and politics, policies need to work together, as well as, it's all changes incredibly difficult for cultural values, aren't they? So that it takes time, and but what can help with that is obviously media coverage, together with the legal system supporting it, together with politics and different policies that will be put in place. If one of them, and relevant and necessary resources that will be provided to services as well. Without one of those, it's not going to work, or it's going to take a very long time.
Do we need changes in the law? The Women's Equality Party are campaigning for affirmative consent in rape cases. So at the moment, you need to prove a reasonable belief in the woman's consent, but that's open to interpretation. And in Sweden, they brought in a law requiring affirmative consent, because it's very different to say she said yes or she didn't say no. So could you see that were helping to increase the number of convictions and the number of people who are willing to go through the criminal justice system?
I guess in response to that, I would say that there needs to be a multi-pronged approach. I think that one avenue isn't going to solve this completely. Certainly, it seems to me, for, as Eylem suggested, kind of, to initiate change on a cultural level, it does seem to me that there needs to be some kind of, legal reform. However, an intersectional approach is what's really needed, that recognises that the experience for survivors is going to be different, that there are intersecting structures of oppression that make it harder for certain kinds of survivors to come forward, and that actually kind of the legal system as it stands just doesn't work for marginalised peoples. In addition, there's been some great work by Alison Fitz on sexual violence and the kind of Me Too movement, where she critiques, I guess, the movement and how it evolved from a grassroots movement designed to support marginalised survivors and girls and women from low-income communities and communities of colour, to a kind of mainstream white feminist approach to saying we just need better kind of legal, we need legal reform that will make it easier to kind of pick out these bad apples and hold them to account, which again seems to ignore that the bigger picture of how this doesn't happen in isolation. There's not just a few kind of dodgy blokes deciding that they're going to harm women. That does happen, but it's certainly not the only issue. And in actual fact, if we focus on these bad apples, we ignore the other kind of cultural conditions that legitimize other kinds of violence, and we let those other other men and boys and perpetrators of violence off the hook because they're not as bad as that person. All they did was upskirt this person. All they did was grab their waist when they moved past them. That kind of stuff that feels very small, but in actual fact legitimizes all kinds of violence against women.
Is this where we maybe sort of come back to where we started in terms of talking about women's safety? And you made the kind of entirely correct point that we want to not just think about women's safety, but about those who are creating situations in which people are under threat or feel under threat. It seems to be that part of what you're saying there is that actually on the one hand, we want to think about how certain kinds of normalized behaviors make possible all kinds of criminal activity. Actually, those behaviors in themselves just are a problem in themselves, precisely because they make people feel unsafe. And sometimes people sort of say, oh, well, feeling unsafe, well, everyone goes on about wanting safe spaces, blah, blah, blah. But actually, that's wrong. People should not feel unsafe walking around the university in their classes, just going about their normal lives. And not just because that might put them under threat of even worse behaviors, but because that behavior itself just creates an environment that is not a good one for people to be in. And that's this larger issue. We want to tackle domestic violence, we want to tackle sexual assault, we also want to tackle a wider range of behaviors that are just creating a situation that is unacceptable for a learning institution for sure, but for society at large, it seems to me.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I would 100% agree with that. And you're absolutely right. There seems to be this huge push of we would really like equality, and we would like women to be represented at all levels of public life, and yet we aren't doing enough to tackle these really important issues where simply by somebody passing judgment or saying something about the length of someone's skirt in a classroom is going to make that person feel unsafe and feel not welcome. And that's the crucial thing, I think, is that we need to make these spaces, the debate about safe spaces, in inverted commas, it's really about, we're talking about hostile environments. We're talking about people not feeling able to fully participate in public life because they're going to be treated in a particular way and made to feel that they are not welcome and that they shouldn't be participating in public life in full. It's the same as when we say, well, she shouldn't have been out at night. Well, why not? She should be absolutely allowed to be a citizen in the world. Equally, when we talk about violence online, that person could just come off Twitter and then be removed from all the other discourse and debate that they could be engaged in. It's really about making sure that everybody feels safe to participate in public life and be a full citizen.
This kind of cultural shift takes years, though, doesn't it? Years, decades. I mean, when I happen to be flicking through the channels and I come across a Carry On film, I cannot believe that was broadcast, published, is still broadcast, those kinds of attitudes towards women. So these shifts in how we think about one another and how we talk to one another, they take a long time to change, don't they?
They do, but I think that in that context, there's a very interesting question about this position of sort of leaders in society, cultural figures, political figures, how they talk about these issues and how they set kind of a tone. I wonder, Eylem, can you tell us a bit more of what you've been thinking about in relation to politicians and the political discourse around this?
I don't think we can divorce this topic from political discourses, because yes, at cultural level, exactly what you're saying, Alan and Helen. And Aaron, everyone has said it. Exactly as you're saying, yes, there are cultural issues that will change. Change takes time, but politically speaking, we can't really. It's no coincidence that we started this podcast with quotes from politicians as well. I know we're talking about the UK, but my example will come from Turkey, for example. in this case. When the president of Turkey announces quite publicly that women should not be laughing out loud in public, it shouldn't be allowed, however, it's going to be curtailed. They shouldn't be going out and walking in the streets alone after 1 a.m. Those restrictions end up having direct impact on how people behave. And you can see that direct impact in the number of violent cases, particularly honor killings against women and gay men in Turkey, how they've risen over the past decade, and more so in the last few years as well. And I was looking forward to some really promising points from the latest UK government strategy for tackling violence against women and girls. And I really was looking forward to seeing some real change in there. And although it is quite welcome, it still does not go far enough to cover sexual harassment, public sexual harassment. And we do really need a bill that covers all of that. We do need the legal system to work, but also at political level, support from the government. But again, I was thinking, the way in which Boris Johnson himself was talking about Muslim women in this country, referring to them as, the veiled women, as post boxes, for example, and turning them into objects, essentially. Even that discourse is quite violent. And if we are starting with minimal things like that, how do women how should they feel about themselves? And how should women or womanhood be talked about at political levels or in the media as well? The current government does not properly resource services that are needed to support women and girls who are in need, and also men and boys as well who are in need. In this case, we do definitely need a legal kind of a bill, essentially, particularly for this really widespread issue on sexual harassment and abuse, particularly on UK university campuses.
What, Aaron, would you like to see change on university campuses to make, so that we get fewer of these incidents in the future, really?
No, it's a really interesting question, because obviously we've got the learning side, and students want to come to us, to study, but at the same time they want that experience, that university experience, that going out, meeting new people. So we see it for every year in September when we have our new first years. It's always an exciting time for the security department, of course. So we have thousands of 18, 19-year-olds come there. We know that a lot of them have, they've lived at home. They're out of their safe bubble, their home bubble. And obviously they're thrown into the mix with quite often strangers, and they have to find their feet. Some take to it a lot quicker than others, and the laddish culture can definitely develop. Now, the pandemic has created a situation where last year our students, our first years, did not experience a normal university life. So it could be seen that this year, come September, that we've got two sets of freshers again. So we'll have the incoming first years. We'll also have the second years that are going to want to be here to experience what normality should look like. And I personally believe that as a university, we've got a responsibility to we should educate right from the outset about what is acceptable, how to report. If we know about things happening, let's deal with it there and then, as opposed to waiting further down the line if it get escalated. Because we know violence does escalate. It can start off with social media, name calling, and like you say, the next thing, violence will always escalate. So we need to nip that in the bud, but we have to educate more about the calling out man on man. So we had the Sarah Everard vigil here at the university, and again we were approached. We couldn't authorise it because of the COVID, but we said we'd much rather it goes ahead and we can assist you and manage it. It was attended by over 300 students. And a succession of speakers. That was the most interesting 3 hours of my year, listening to the experiences of our female students, of what they've gone through, not just here on campus, but at home, as they've grown up as children, by work colleagues, by family friends, the abuse, the violence perpetrated towards them. As quite honestly, it was horrifying. What was good is that a lot of the students found it quite cathartic to speak openly with their peers, with other women that had gone through similar things, and yeah, it was really good to see that. And I think if more men had witnessed that and actually heard first-hand accounts, then that would make them think, because it certainly made me think. And I thought it was a really good event.
Helen and Eylem, we've talked about various things that we think could be done, should be done. What else would you like to see to make this situation better?
There's a unique set of circumstances that happen when somebody goes away to university, but as Aaron's example already, his personal example already demonstrated, this happens so much earlier than we can anticipate. This is happening in schools. Schools aren't safe environments for young girls at all. By the time they get to university, it won't be their first experience of a kind of violence. It will have happened at school. And I think until we recognise the extent of the problem, and as Aaron said, kind of see these as opportunities to engage boys and men in the discussion about how their behaviour can be harmful, and encourage a culture where men and boys feel able to not call out, but perhaps call in behaviour when they're able to recognise it and acknowledge it and start a conversation about it. That seems crucial, because I think there are certain things that can happen at university level. I think there are certain things that need to happen in terms of disciplinary, kind of our disciplinary procedures. One of the things that struck me, survivor-centred, so that there isn't a huge burden of proof on survivors. And I think that there is a false equivalence between reports and false allegations, that I don't think that those numbers are anywhere near comparable. And so I think our focus really does need to be survivor focused, but this needs to happen very early on. This needs to happen in schools as well.
Eylem, what would you like to see change, not just at university but in the wider world?
I just want to raise two issues. One of them is about, we've talked about prevention, we talked about resources or their lack of, and one of the figures that is quite alarming, and this was from 2019, there were about 5,000 women who were turned away from a refuge due to lack of space when they needed help most. Equally, migrant women are not included in the domestic abuse bill as it currently stands. So we do ask for their passport, what passport they hold, before we do help them, or we can help them when domestic abuse services in particular can help them. So that's one issue that I want to kind of leave here. But the other one, and definitely for further podcast for sure, but the other issue is we're talking about, we've covered campus violence and so on, but beyond that there are other levels of violence, like forced marriage, like FGM, like so-called honor killings, and these things do not just happen elsewhere in the world, they happen very much so in the UK. And it's only really recently, to the point of 2 weeks ago, when, for instance, FGM has been brought into policy and it's banned and so on. So we really need to work with, and as universities, as academics, as scholars, we are responsible in working with those communities, I think, to provide the research that is needed, to provide the evidence that is needed so that policies can change, so that our work can be impactful, can actually be a drop in the ocean. Because change is, as we said, really slow, but it can happen. It is happening every day.
Now, it's been a really interesting discussion, I think, really helpful as well. We've touched over such a load of issues, from the personal and the local and the university-based to the regional and the national and so forth. But I think for me, the kind of theme that comes out is how important it is to pay attention to people, to hear what it is they're saying, to kind of learn from what they're telling you, and be on the one hand pleased that we can hear people and can listen to them, and perhaps we didn't always do so, but also conscious that what we're hearing is, as Aaron and Helen and Eylem said, giving us some things we've got to do to try and make things better.
All right, that's all for now. The reporter today was Jasmine Oak. Thank you to our guests, Helen Warner, Aaron Grant, Eylem, Atakav, and thanks to the BBC, Sky, Guardian and ITN for our news clips. And thank you, of course, for listening. Goodbye.